Welcome back to the Single Dad's online podcast, Online Dad, and I am the Online Dad. Well, welcome. It's 1 o'clock. Actually, it's 1:02, running a little behind. And this is the first official podcast that I am having regarding single dads. So this particular podcast I am entitling Society and Single Dads. And this particular podcast is going to try and identify kind of four key things about being a single dad. Who are single dads, the impact of absent single dads, disengaged single dads, and why many of them are disengaged, and then the term Disneyland dad. And sprinkled within there, we'll talk a little bit about the grief process and understanding how that is impacting you and your children as you try and be a proactive single dad. And I want to preface it with that a lot of the rules of being a single dad have changed since COVID 2020. We've got over 415,000 people that have passed away from COVID. And among some of you might be your wife had passed away or your co-partner had passed away due to COVID, launching you into the role of being a single dad, and a lot of changes that go with it, in addition to the significant pain and loss that you have when you lose somebody, especially when it's unexpected. So I think we'll just start kind of like who are single dads that are out there right now. Single dads, There's a lot of perceptions out there of what a single dad is and the perception of what a stereotype, if you will, of single dads. And how does someone become a single dad? Well, the obvious is a choice. You adopt. You decide to become a parent without having a co-parent with you or a spouse with you. And then there's unwed fathers that you foster, you adopt. You get a divorce. Believe it or not, that is a choice. Even though you didn't want the divorce or didn't plan on the divorce, the choice is still made to be divorced. And, or I should say one of you would be the choice to be divorced. And then there's not a choice. And not a choice could be military deployment. Okay, your spouse ends up being deployed for the next 3 to 6 months. A sudden death, we talked about that a little bit earlier. Incarceration, or some sort of other apparent abandonment, deportation. There's just a lot of things out there that life gets in the way that may cause the separation, launching you into being a single dad. Keep in mind that even under the best of circumstances, transitioning to a single parent household is not easy. And even if you have a stable job and you're making a steady income, the emotional change within your family dynamic just is also a component that isn't very easily navigated. And then if you are in a situation where the finances are greatly impacted, just adds more stress on top of that loss. There are two perceptions of single dads. The in public perception tends to be see my kids on a regular basis, trash talk about the other parent in front of their friends, coworkers, or even the new partner you may have. May also complain about the divorce proceedings. Things are great, kids are great, participating whenever they can, and that's what we put out there. We don't try and show vulnerability and weakness. However, in private, or maybe even just a close network of friends and family, you feel that there's nowhere to turn. Hard to start over, especially if you've been with somebody for 10 or more years raising kids together, and all of a sudden there's a drastic change in that. Learning how to kind of start that from square one is not always easy. And then the older you get, it's not that it's harder, but you get more rooted in your routine. And we as human beings are creatures of habit, and we're not big fans of change, especially if it's change we don't want. You feel that things are unfair. You might have lost your house. You miss your kids because you don't get to see them with the same level of time that you had when you guys were together. You're now paying child support. You might even have to pay some sort of level of maintenance. You may have to, give your ex-spouse other thing, may had to give up the house and you don't get anything out of the house. It's just, it's unfair. The court system still treat single dads or dads becoming divorced as the bad guy in most cases. It is getting better. It has gotten better over the years, but more often than not, when you go into that courtroom, they just automatically assume that you're going to be the deadbeat dad. And it's a preconceived notion. I know when we're establishing paternity for my son, because I had a son out of wedlock, and it just amazed me how the judge was different with my son's mother than he was with me. And then, to give you just one other quick example, at one point I was paying the clerk of the circuit court the child support, and that is pretty much the norm these days. But back in the late 80s and 90s, there was some flexibility of paying your children's mother, directly. So I was paying through the system, and his mom was having difficulty. Those checks, they showed up. If I had to have it by the 15th, she might not get it to the 30th. So it just became a problem. So she wanted to put me back, wanted me to start paying her directly. So we went to court, and the judge refused to grant that because he looked me right in the eye and says, the minute I do this, you're going to take off. Never mind that she says I've been a very active dad in my son's life, and the attorney's like, he's done everything he's supposed to do to be a dad, proactive in his son's life, and the judge just wouldn't do it. And it's just a stigma because in his practice, he's done that, and then the dad takes off and not paying. So that's just another example of how things can be unfair. Sometimes you feel like you're the bad guy. No matter how the loss occurred, somewhere along the line, you feel like it's your fault. And that is a normal feeling to have when you're dealing with a negative change in your life or a loss in your life, that somewhere along the line you might feel that you had something to do with it. And even though, again, the loss wasn't your fault, and if it was a divorce situation, and you got divorced from your spouse because there was an affair, then you start saying, well, maybe because I didn't do enough for my spouse, that's why there was an affair. There's always a reason to push blame or point fingers, and single dads, we tend to do that to ourselves. That hopeless feeling that you'll never be happy again, that your kids will never forgive you if you're having to move. And you might be going from a 3-bedroom house and a backyard and a fence and a dog, and now you're moving into a 1-bedroom or a studio apartment, and you just feel hopeless. It feels like you're just taking giant leaps backwards. And private also tends to the added expenses. Now instead of 2 people paying the bills and helping the kids and driving to the games and taking them to the doctors, it's now on your shoulders. So a lot of times that's your expense. And you're paying child support, and as I said before, you might be paying some maintenance. You may be on for all the health insurance, which may increase your deductible. Where maybe before, again, you had a spouse that was contributing to the bills. Now it's all on you. The grocery bills, the rent, most rent is higher than most mortgage payments these days. You continue to add expenses. You might have had to get a different car than the car you had before. There's a lot of things that happen with that add the expenses, not to mention all the court costs and legal fees when you do become a single parent. You struggle to integrate back into the children's lives as a single dad. So you had a routine. Every day, you saw your kids in the morning, you saw them when you came home, took them to the doctor, saw them watching TV, the issues with them always being on the phones, it's a routine, but you saw your kids. Now you're taking a step back and you don't get to see your kids with the same veracity that you had before, the same frequency you had before. And now you kind of like the stranger coming in, and even though you're not supposed to feel that way, that's just how it becomes. The house that maybe you mowed the lawn on, now you got to knock on the door just for somebody to invite you in. And, running into, neighbors and friends that you knew while you were married or were together, now all of a sudden becomes awkward. So that's how it tends to be in private. And I know society right now, you always don't show weakness and vulnerability, and we tend to put on that game face. And that's where I think a lot of the misconceptions of the courts, because they see these dads, going about their day and their business pretending there's nothing wrong, where moms have no problem showing their emotions and their feelings of the difficulty difficulties and struggles they have. So that's why there's two perceptions of that. The other thing is it's stereotypical, and some people would call it sexist, but we hide our vulnerabilities more so than women do because we grew up with the attitude of be a man. Suck it up, be a man, deal with it. You still got to move forward in your life. And while you see the positive in that statement to try and encourage you for strength to forge through, sometimes we take that to the extreme and we're dying inside and we hurt inside and we want to scream inside, but we don't want to show it. And we don't want to show it to our family because we don't want them to show that it's, she got the best of you or it's really hard. And sometimes we don't want to show it because we feel if we show it, then we can't handle it because you've seen other dads have worse situations and they're fine. You try to treat single parenting as a business transaction. Yeah, we got divorced, got the paper signed, I get to see my kids every other Tuesday and every other weekend, get to take them to the games, but it becomes part of your appointments in your calendar. It's like a business transaction. So it's not that you don't love your kids any less, but the way your coping mechanism is just kind of add them to your calendar as part of your routine. Instead of when you saw them every day, you would have discussions. Oh, by the way, I need a ride to the game, or I need poster paper for a project. Now it's like you got to put it in your calendar to make sure you forget because you're not there from day to day. And the other piece of that is that you're moving or relocating. You might be further away because of a job opportunity that you had to take. And if you were with your family, there might have been an informed decision to move collectively together. But in this case, you might be further away, as much as an hour, 2 hours. And in some cases, some single dads end up moving out of state or across country because of a job. The next thing we want to hit about is understanding how grief works. And I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail about grief and loss, but just to understand in general how grief works into that routine. And yes, there are stages of grief, and we can explain the stages of grief, and that's not really how we're going to look at that today in any great sense of detail. But things you got to know about grief, and yes, to identify the grief inside yourself, but also understand how your kids are reacting to the changes going on in their life now that you are a single dad. There is no test or medical diagnosis to confirm grief. None. You can't take a blood test or a litmus test and say, oh yeah, you're grieving. It's not out there. There's no set time frame to grieve. Society, especially today, says, you got 30 days. And some religious cultures even say you've got X amount of time to grieve and then you need to move on. But you cannot limit that because grief, when something happens tragic, whether it be a death, divorce, abandonment, deployment, incarceration, it's the death of a relationship, it's a death of a way of life. And the closer you are to the situation, the more painful it becomes. So you can't have a set time. And as you get older and you mature and you become more introspective, or as your kids, they were young and now they're young adolescents and there's gray areas and they're teenagers and it's all about them, how they process their loss changes with how you march through this world. There are things when I was in my 20s that I look back now in my 50s and I'm thinking, what the hell was I thinking? What was I thinking? And I'm thinking, or things that I remember that were very stressful in my 20s, I look back now in my 50s and going, that was no big deal. So that's why there's no time frame, because sometimes there is a trigger that might relive some of that pain that you didn't quite work through. And rest assured, in order to navigate grief properly, to be able to move forward and be proactive in your life, you need to grieve. But that doesn't mean it's 6 months. It doesn't mean it's a year. It doesn't even mean it's 5 years or 10 years. As long as you're making that journey through grief, and it might be years later, as long as you're working through it, it's positive. I kind of like, I look at grief as there's a grief cup, to give you an analogy, and that we as human beings can handle so many bumps in the roads at excuse me, at a certain time. And a lot of times a tragic loss. So, let me give you an example. Studies have shown that adults can handle one major hiccup a year, one major tragedy in our year. That could be a loss of a job. It could be maybe you had some major surgery, one big hiccup. And then when you become divorced or you become a single parent, that's like 7 of those major incidents being thrown into that glass. And that glass is finite. You don't just get a taller glass. And what happens is a lot of times that grief and loss tends to spill over. Well, the way you empty that cup is to grieve. So sometimes it might sit on the brim for the longest time and you're not working on it and you get stuck and you're always angry or always depressed or you're always blaming yourself because you're not able to process that loss. The way you empty that grief cup is that you talk about it. They say the average person has to talk about a major event in their lives, especially a tragic one, about 30 times before they can start moving forward. So that's whether one person gets to hear the same story 30 times, 2 people 15, or 30 people one time, but you've got to tell the story. And that's how you empty that grief cup. It's okay to cry. It's okay to be emotional. Excuse me. It's okay to do all of that, but you have to empty that cup from time to time. Now, you may run into a problem where you go to a doctor, whether it be a psychologist, a psychiatrist, or a therapist, and they want to prescribe medication for you to help you get through the hump. Just remember, society is does not want you to have a long-term grieving process, and then so the thing I need to do is be put on pills. Okay, medications tend to treat the symptoms, not the problem. So you might feel better and you might not be as angry, as upset, or as stressed, but understand that if you don't process your loss, you can take those medications for the rest of your life because you're not working through that loss. There is no experience out there that prepares you for this loss. We walk around in our lives carrying a backpack of experiences. And we take that backpack, and every time we have an experience, we take that backpack and that result, good or bad, and we put it in there. For example, the first time you fell and hurt yourself, or you cut your knee, or you cut your finger, or banged your head, you went running home crying to mom or dad because you fell and it hurt, and you might be bleeding or it's scraped. And you watched as one of your parents clean it up. They put a little antibacterial ointment. In my day, it was mercurochrome or Bactine. Rubbing alcohol, hydrogen peroxide, put a Band-Aid on it, make it all better, maybe even give you a cookie and a kiss on the Band-Aid, and you were off. And so you take that experience and you put it in that backpack. So the next time you fall and hurt yourself and you go home to mom or dad and there's nobody there, you know what you need to do. Okay, I got to clean it off. I got to put this on it. I got to put a Band-Aid on it, and got to find my cookie. And it's a very simplistic way to do that, but we continually take experiences in our lives and we put them in that backpack, and that way we can adapt them or assimilate them when a similar situation comes up. So if you're an adult in your 20s and 30s, you don't have as much in your arsenal backpack as somebody that might be in their 30s, 40s, or 50s or older being a single dad. But rest assured, you do have something to pull from. However, when it comes to tragic loss or emotional trauma, there is not a single experience that you can say prepared you for this loss. Even if you lost a grandma or a grandpa when you were younger, or even maybe when you're older, oh yeah, well, I lost my grandma and grandpa, so I know how it feels. But then when you experience it again, it doesn't prepare you for it. There are some experts out there that feel that diagnosing grief as a disorder is really a solution. We'll diagnose it as a disorder, we can prescribe you medication and treat it as a mental disorder. It's not a disorder. Grieving is not a disorder. And anybody who tells you, suck it up, be a man, you got to be strong for your kids, and move on, and your kids will be fine once they see that you're fine, are gravely mistaken. Gravely mistaken. You need to understand that this is not a mental handicap. We need to process in order to grow from the experience and in order to be better people, we need to have the negative with the positive. And grieving is going through that negative so we can get to the positive. We don't want society to tell us that grief shouldn't be long-term because it's going to create long-term problems. So you do it short-term, you prescribe yourself medication. In the long run, it's going to cause you more problems. It's going to cause you more problems. If you as an adult, if you think about it, think about when you got divorced, you became a single parent, of how you felt. And as I just told you, you may not, nothing prepares you for it. And you try and pull some of those experiences to kind of help you navigate some of those waters, and it might make you feel better for a little bit of time, but ultimately doesn't prepare you. Think about your kids. Think about your kids who have at least 10, if not 15 or more years less experience than you. So if you're struggling to work through it and put the puzzle pieces together to make yourself move forward, imagine what your kids are going through. They need your guidance more so, and it becomes harder when you're trying to grieve together, but grieving together is exactly the way you make it through this grieving process. When you become an absent dads that truly don't grieve or hinder, don't go through that grieving process and don't come around and don't talk about it, you're hindering the grieving process for your children. So you put on a game face like nothing's wrong, very fine, how exciting, got a new house, new traditions, we're going through all of that, and you don't take any time to acknowledge their pain and acknowledge your own pain, you're hindering that process of their children. I have maintained for a very long time that if children don't learn how to properly work through their grief, and you can even argue this with adults, they're going to find a way to process their loss, and it may not be healthy. That could be drug addiction, alcohol addiction, sexual promiscuity, gang violence. All of that stuff can become a way for kids to cope. There's a theorist out there, Jean-Claude Piaget, and his theory out there is that we must have coping mechanisms through our life so we can handle change. And if we don't have those coping mechanisms to keep that balance in our lives, so we have to have that balance. So something bad happens, we got to bring it back into balance. Whether, you hurt your knee and it hurts, so you clean it out, you put a Band-Aid on it, maybe an ace bandage on it. And what you're doing is you're learning to cope with the bad knee until it heals and you feel better, trying to achieve that balance in our lives. So when you're grieving, you're emotionally out of balance. And if you can't figure out a way or have tools to help you get yourself back into balance, you will find strategies that are negative impacting to help you feel that balance. And one of the reasons why increase in alcohol consumption and increase in spending on credit cards and kids taking up smoking, and it's their way to cope with how they're feeling. And those are not healthy ways to cope. So dads, you gotta be sure, one, you gotta stay in your kids' lives, and two, you have to acknowledge the grief and the loss. Now, if the grief and the loss, was your fault, whatever that reason may be, you need to be able to take out, or you're the one that asked for the divorce, maybe it wasn't your fault, but you're the one who asked for the divorce, you may have to take some heat from your kids. Because you may have an ex-spouse, but your kids don't have ex-parents, and they love you equally. They love you equally. So you have to be there, and you might have to take it. You might have to take a hit, and they blame you, and they lash out at you, and yes, it may be unrealistic, and yes, it may be unjustified, but they have to be able to go through that, and without the proper tools, sometimes it comes out as yelling, and think about it. You've done it too, where you've gotten a little emotional, and you snap back out at a family member. So we have to be able to take that. We have to be the adults, and we need to do that. Grief is simply emotional based. Okay? Since it's emotional based, it does control your actions. So going back to that backpack that you carry, all of your experiences, good and bad and indifferent, when you have a tragic loss, like a death or a divorce or an emotional trauma, that's like a pen exploding into your backpack. And we've all had pens explode in our pocket and explode in our trouser pants or our briefcases. And of course, women have had them explode in their purses. And even when we go to school in our backpacks and it just stains everything. That's how grief is. It stains everything. Even the most positive emotions and memories that you have on a family vacation is tarnished now by your grief and your loss. And all of a sudden that vacation wasn't so much fun. Or, well, that's never going to happen again. There's always a reason. And if you don't clean that ink out of there, anything new you put in that backpack is going to get tarnished as well and get stained as well. So your emotional processes controls your actions. And if you're emotionally negative and emotionally depressed and emotionally frozen, how you handle day-to-day life is not going to be positive or proactive. Emotion is an essential ingredient in creating memories. Think about every memory you can remember, good or bad. And there is an emotion attached to it. I mean, think about when you've got the bicycle you wanted at Christmas and you got it. Think about the emotion you felt. Or think about the emotion, and I don't know, depending on your age, at Christmas time, after Christmas and you go back to school after Christmas break, a lot of times you try and convince your mom or dad to let you take one of those toys to school or one of those things to school so you can show off what you got, especially if it was one of those popular toys that everybody wants. But think about how you felt with it. Think about how you felt if somebody took that new toy you got for Christmas and put it out in the street so a car would run over it into pieces. What's driving your actions now? Positive emotions or negative emotions? Right? So if you don't process the loss and help your kids process the loss, that ink will stay in that backpack forever. There is no appropriate solution to a threatening solution. Threatening to hurt somebody, giving an or else ultimatums. I remember my dad pretty much telling me that there were questions about for the divorce. My parents got divorced. There were some questions, and he didn't want to talk about it. And it's past. It's in the past. You should have asked me then. I'm not talking about it again. And he got angry about it. But those threatening solutions is not going to fix the solution. When it comes to emotions of the heart, no matter how old you are, we're still little kids inside. We want the pain to go away, and running away seems like the viable solution. All right. Now, let me give you another quick example of that. So I'm going to ask you this question. Your brain can differentiate between physical and emotional danger. Okay, so think about that. A car coming at you, or somebody calling you an idiot or fat or stupid or, calling names because you can't keep control of your emotions. Can your brain differentiate between that physical and emotional danger? Give you a second to think about that. Okay, the answer would be false. It can't. There's a book out there back in the 90s by Robert Sliwester. It's called Celebrating Neurons. And the purpose of that book was to help educators understand your students' brains and how they think, so ultimately become a better teacher. So when I read the book, I was supposed to be reading it for me because I was an educator for 16 years, and all I could think about was how grief and loss is processed. So the book is called Celebrating Neurons, and since most contemporary stress results from emotional problems, our stress responses are often maladaptive, which basically means, the fight or flight attitude in most American towns, we don't have to worry about dying every day. We don't have to worry about somebody eating us. We don't have to worry about somebody killing us. We don't have somebody going outside and chopping our heads off. That most, and don't get me wrong, there are some pretty bad neighbors out there, and they may have to worry about that on a regular basis, but in most cases, it doesn't. So over the last, million years, that fight or flight response has now become more emotional. So our stress mechanisms cannot differentiate between physical and emotional danger. So somebody putting a gun in your face and saying, "Give me all your money or I'm going to kill you," has the same emotional impact as mom and dad are getting a divorce. And you might even raise your eyebrow or scoff at it or even kind of chuckle at it that that's not even remotely true. Remember, we're talking about your emotions. We're not talking about the physical act of somebody put a gun in your finger. We're talking about the emotional response. And because most of us don't get up every single day worrying about whether we're going to die but at the hand of somebody else or some animal going to eat us, and it's just how we've merged it. We've merged those emotional and physical stresses in our brain that they can't differentiate between the two. Approximately 50% of all children do not see their fathers after the divorce, and few have spent the night in their father's new home in the past month. So going back to that example that I just gave you regarding physical and emotional danger, and then you couple this with the statistic that 50% of all children do not see their father after the divorce, and few have spent the night at their father's home in the past month. So why are these dads taking off? Why are they becoming absent dads? Why are they taking off? Typically, 84% of the children reside with their mothers as their mailing address and their home base. So that means, it's less than 20 or 15% are actually seeing actually living with the dads. Absent dads impact your kids' future and your future as parents. Children of divorce are 5 times as likely to be suspended from school, 3 times as likely to need psychological counseling, 2 times as likely to repeat a grade. Even with the school system now not really holding kids back and making them repeat a grade, but become deficient in their education, their studies. Children tend to be more absent from school. I don't feel well. What's wrong? My stomach hurts. They don't want to go to school. Okay, parents, you can even turn that into yourself. You don't feel like going to work, so you call in sick. You're late to school more often. There's always a crisis, or you're just simply not motivated to get to school, to get the kids to school. And if you're driving them to school and they're dragging their feet, kids will do that normally, but add the grief and loss component to that, and it's a big burden. They don't want to go to school because they feel like they're the only ones going through it. Sometimes they tend to show more health problems. There is a direct link between your emotional stability and your physical health. And, your immune system, it drops down when you're under a lot of stress and you're not feeling good about yourself and you're hurting inside. Your immune system tends to drop and you have more health problems. Some of those health problems may even be what they call psychosomatic, where they think they're sick. It's a coping mechanism for pain because they don't know how to work. They don't know how to work through it. Some things you need to keep in mind as a single dad. This is not always the best advice. And you have people give you this advice for yourself, or say this is what you need to do with your kids. I'm going to just fly a big, huge red flag up there and saying, I'm not sure I would agree with this. It's the best advice. You'll get over it. Well, while yes, that may be the case, but you're only going to get over it if you work through your pain and your loss for yourself as well as your children. Crying won't help. Well, crying is not going to fix the divorce or the reason why you became a single parent, but it is going to help you empty that grief cup and help you expel some of those emotions that you have nowhere to go with them. The term "be strong," right? There's a time and a place for that. Yes, you're the adult, and sometimes you need to put on the game face and be strong for your kids or be strong for family members, even though it might be highly uncomfortable or you're just emotionally drained. But there's a time and a place for that. It's not always have the game face on. You have to be vulnerable to your children. And talking to friends and family about what you're going through and the pain, if you want the support, you have to be vulnerable for that. Somebody says to you, it's time to move on. Well, if it's been 10, 15, 20 years and you're still struggling issues with grief and loss, then you got to kind of figure out, why are we still kind of in the same place that we were in when it first happened? Why can I remember the loss as vivid as it happened yesterday? So yeah, it might be time to move on, but you can't move on until you figure out why you haven't moved on. Why are you stuck? Why can't you move on? So sometimes it's just not that easy. All right? You tell your kids, you're too young to understand. Well, you might be on a technical statement saying, yeah, you might be right, they might be too young to understand, but then you have to explain it to them in an age-appropriate manner. With younger kids, before the age of 10, a lot of it's just concrete thinking. The light switch goes on, the light switch goes off. So you keep everything age-appropriate, and you can have a nice conversation with them or an emotional conversation with them. Okay, when you tell your children not to put their finger in the socket, it's not, you don't give them an explanation of why or how they could shock themselves by putting their finger in the socket or putting a fork in the socket. You just tell them no, and it's dangerous, and you make it very simple. Well, it's the same thing with kids and grief and loss and why mommy's not coming home or why you're not living it with us with mommy. You keep it at that level. You just keep it as an age appropriate level. So to tell a 5, 6, 7, 8, 9-year-old, well, you're too young to understand, you're not helping them understand. Because they're very observant and they're watching you and they know something's not right. I mean, clearly you're not living in the house anymore. But you can't just tell them you're too young to understand as a deflection not to deal with it or to work with it. Other misleading cliches about grief and loss real quickly. Grief and mourning are the same experience. They're not. Adults have all the answers. Why we as adults would like to think that. We don't. And I said to you earlier that, that no matter how many experiences you have, nothing ever prepares you for your own emotional trauma. An adult's grief does not affect your child. That's absolutely wrong, 100% wrong. How you handle your grief is how you're going to handle your children's grief or not handle their children's grief. The grieving process when there's a change in the family dynamic is a family function, and you have to do it together. Even though your kids may say everything's fine, and then physically they say I'm fine, and they're active and they're doing everything they did before, doesn't mean they're not grieving. Another quick one: adults should avoid topics that cause crying or emotional release. Well, again, time and a place, but you can't always avoid it. At the holidays, when the family's supposed to be together at Christmas time, and you're celebrating Christmas the day before. Sometimes you have to talk about those topics, and your anniversary date that's no more, and if you became a single parent because you lost your spouse. You have to be. A lot of times the kids won't follow suit until you model it for them. So start talking about age appropriately what's bothering you with with what you're feeling with the loss. All right. You work through your grief and your children's grief by understanding the grief and the pain that you're going through, encouraging each other for expression of how they're thinking and feeling, and encouraging them to move forward, commemorating the past and not just digging a hole and dump it and said it's done and over with. You got to commemorate it, celebrate it, because there were good memories before that loss happened. There's no reason to forget them or to get rid of them. And then looking forward to moving on, looking forward. Grief, I'll give you grief one more quick analogy. You know that you're processing the loss, your kids are processing the loss. So when you look out the window and you see a storm coming in, you see the dark clouds rolling in, you might even hear the rumble as the thunder, the wind kicks up, then all of a sudden the rain comes pelting down, maybe hitting the glass of the window you're looking at, and and maybe even seeing some sticks hit the window and branches falling. But you're not getting wet. You're not getting wet. That's how you know you're moving forward. So when you're reliving the loss like it happened yesterday and you cry at the drop of a hat when you think about it, or there are things about the loss that you haven't been able to process, that's what happens. You're getting wet. You watch that storm come at you with the windows wide open. So when you know you're not getting wet, you can rethink of a memory that normally would have upset you, and all of a sudden it's an integrated memory. Then you know you're working through your grief. Being okay with your grief, or saying that it isn't that bad, or I don't really have the proper word. I'm not saying it's okay that you got divorced. I'm not saying it's okay your spouse died. I'm not saying it's okay your spouse is deployed and they may not come home. What it's saying is you're integrating that loss into your daily routine so it becomes more normal and more commonplace. And understand, folks, there's levels of grief that we never truly work through. So while your day-to-day is fine, if your spouse had passed away and you go to the cemetery, you might cry. And, and there's nothing wrong with that. That doesn't mean you're not grieving because you miss the person. But it's not an everyday thing where you're waking up each day not able to function. Okay, remember, we have to endure this loss with your kids. So if you're not living with your kids and they see you so often, I'm not saying every weekend needs to be a discussion about grief and loss and how you're handling it, but at the same time, you can't just ignore it. All right, how are we doing on time here? We got about 10 minutes left. Here's another hint, dads, that you know that your child is grieving unhealthfully. Not It's not a safe process. So normal reactions to grief in youth: shock, loss of appetite, restless sleep, become a little bit withdrawn, irritable and crabby, complain about headaches, the stomach hurts, don't want to go into work. You might see a decline or increase in your grades. So a lot of people will tell you, the grades went down, so clearly your kid is grieving. But if all of a sudden, your kid's going from, C's to A's, or those A's were maintained, they never dropped down. Well, they didn't drop down, they must be okay. No. Whether they maintain their grades or their grades decline or their grades increase after the loss, they're looking for ways to find that balance again. So they're immersing themselves in work. And dads, you've heard this. Just bury yourself in your work so you can forget about it. Well, a diversion is good. I'm okay with a diversion. But you can't let that diversion dominate it to the point where you don't ever take that grief cup off the shelf and work on getting it emptied. You have discipline problems with your kids. Most of it, you have discipline problems anyway if you're not experiencing an emotional loss, but you may have a few more. But this is how you know that it's gone beyond, that the grief is manifesting itself in negative ways. So instead of going from shock, your kids are in total denial of that event. It never happened. They operate like you guys are going to get back together. And if your spouse had passed away, mom's not really dead. You're operating like she's going to come through that door any minute. A loss of appetite transforms itself into an eating disorder. Restless sleep turns into nightmares, or they won't sleep alone anymore. Sometimes bedwetting happens again, depending on the age of your kids. Instead of being a little withdrawn, there's complete and total isolation, where they isolate themselves from their friends, their family. They simply go out of their room to go to school and come home, or maybe go to school and work, come home, but they do not want to interact. Instead of irritable and crabby, you have physical aggression and violence. Okay, so, irritable and crabby is okay, but if they're physically hurting themselves or other people or inciting violence, we're past its normal grief. Okay, instead of just a simple stomachache or headache, you have psychosomatic illnesses, migraine. I had this pain in my side. Oh, the pain is so bad. It's psychosomatic. It's just that. There's nothing wrong, but your mind makes it feel like there's something wrong. Instead of discipline problems, now all of a sudden your kids are in the trouble with the law. They're hanging around gang members or people that you would think are affiliated with gangs. You have increased use of drug and alcohol abuse, sexual activity, stealing money. That you're not grieving that loss in a healthful, HEATHFUL way. It's very unhealthful. If you have any questions at any time, and I've got a few more things to go over, but if you ever have questions during a podcast at some point, there's the chat room, so if you're on listening, email me. My website's www.singledadsonline.org, and you can log in, and then you can email me there. I'll be happy to answer your questions. If you are listening and able to chat, and you want to go into the chat room and talk while I'm talking, happy to do that for you. The last thing real quick before we run out of some time is Disneyland Dad. And what Disneyland Dad is in a nutshell is that every time you see your kids, it's a party, it's a holiday, you're spending money, you're making things fun. All of that is good from time to time, okay, but doing it on a regular basis, you're overcompensating. You want them to come visit you more often. You want them to forget about their pain and their loss. You want to forget about your pain and your loss. So you give them stuff that they like to do. Okay, that's overcompensation, and you don't want to do that. Okay, it has nothing to do with not having fun with your children. Okay, dads go from seeing their kids daily to once a week or biweekly. It makes perfect sense. The logic is there. Okay, you take away your routines. You don't have to do chores. There's no bedtime. There's no boundaries. You're overcompensating for that loss. Easy way to avoid uncomfortable discussions because you don't have to do that. You go from being a parent to being their friend. You compete with the other parent or the step-parent. Try to outdo them. Sends the wrong message to your kids. Might even cause additional friction with your ex-spouse. So I'm going to kind of leave it there. We're running